Greetings and God bless. Welcome to another episode of Pastor Mike, Dynamic Voices for a Diverse Church, powered by The Witness, a Black Christian collective. I'm your host, Tyler Burns. You follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Burns Clan. Please follow at your own risk. And joining me, as always, is the founder of The Witness. He has a very extensive bio. He is the man, the myth, the legend, the soon-to-be three-time best-selling author, Mr. Blue Check Verified himself. You can follow his writings at jamartisby.substack.com. Dr. Jamar Tisby, what's going on, brother?
Hey, glad you got that jamartisby.substack.com in there. I'm not sure everybody knows that they can follow or subscribe for free or be a paid subscriber at jamartisby.substack.com. But
yeah, exactly. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that they know, my brother, but we're going to make sure that the word gets out there, okay?
I appreciate you.
You quiet about it, but we're going to make sure the word gets out there, man. We are. Man, so we are here today. We're laughing at the beginning, but this is a serious topic.
Heavy.
Heavy. And you know what's funny is, and ironic is, I wanted to actually title this episode 38,000 Dead and Counting. But the truth of the matter is, bro, we don't know how many people have been killed or have died as a result of what is continuously going on in Gaza. And I think it would be right, brother. We haven't even talked about this beforehand, but I think it'd be right to call this a genocide, my man.
That's the only appropriate term. It's the only appropriate term. There are laws about how to wage war, internationally agreed upon. And one of the most basic rules is you don't target non-combatants. You don't bomb civilian places. And what's happened throughout this war is the government of Israel has said, well, we're going after insurgents that are hiding in these places. Mm-hmm. Okay. To the count of 38,000 that we know.
Yeah.
At what point, bro?
You know, so this all for a lot of people in the popular conversation started on October 7th. So this is what people say is this started on October 7th when Hamas attacked I believe it was a civilian festival, music festival / concert. And there were a lot of civilian Israeli casualties. And as a result of hostages taken as well. So as a result of that, the Israeli government responded and has continued to respond. But for those of us who have kind of been following this conflict and kind of been clued into a little bit more than just the popular talking points, we don't really establish the start of this conflict on October 7th. This goes far, far, far back, decades back. So for many of us, like, we just got introduced to the conversation based upon October 7th. But the reality is this has been going on for a long time. Ongoing conversations about occupation or the viability of a two-state solution or settler colonialism or oppression. And it's been very frustrating, I think, for many of us to have this conversation because automatically the second that you start talking about genocide, the second that you start talking about civilian life, it gets dichotomized down to, oh, you must be anti-Semitic, you must, hate Jewish people, or you must have a replacement theology, or you must have this concept and idea that Jewish people don't matter, and this is systemically what created the Holocaust in the first place. All these conversations that really take us away from the principal idea, which is that human life is being destroyed right in front of us, and that the death and the killing of anyone, especially people who are not involved in this at all, who are not combatants, who are children, who are innocent women, people who are not involved in any of the armed conflict, it's an evil. And I think it's important to say that. It's important to say that it's evil. It's important to call it what it is. And it's not a time for us to ignore what's going on.
I'll be real raw. When October 7th happened, I paused. I hesitated to speak out about the evil that was taking place in general. Obviously, the attack itself was evil, but as you say, there's a longer history. And then what comes after is evil, right? And part of the pause was, okay, let me figure out actually what's going on. Let's move beyond the heat and the noise, try to see if there's some consistencies in the reports coming out so that we get a sense of actually what's happening there. I think that's wise in general. But there was a longer pause. But there was a longer pause that I did because I also started to see the blowback of folks who were defending Palestinian life being accused of being anti-Semitic. And that's the last thing I would want to be accused of. Many of us would want to be accused of, right? The Jewish people as a people have been through it historically and even up to the present day. There's anti-Semitic movements. There's violence against Jewish people simply because they're Jewish. We understand and get that.
Namely white supremacy, man.
As you say, white supremacy. This is all part and parcel. If you look at the Ku Klux Klan talking points, they are very anti-Semitic, and all of this is of a
Charlottesville.
Piece. Yeah. Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. That whole chant, all of that stuff is in there, and we get that. There is a difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
Yeah.
Right. And listen, we're not coming on here as political pundits or policy.
Nah, but I mean, this is the Black Christian. We're Black Christians.
That's what I'm saying.
Trying to navigate what this looks like on a human level.
On a human level,
for the shalom and flourishing of all image bearers, and for the justice that we believe God intends for His church to be at the forefront to speak towards. So, absolutely, nah, man. I think everybody knows that. And if you don't know that, I think you're having this conversation in bad faith, and none of what we're saying in terms of disclaimers is going to make any difference for you.
Because we could do a whole episode of disclaimers, right? There's so many layers to this. One is the kind of narrative that has been promulgated by right-wing conservative dispensationalist Christianity. You know what I'm talking about? About Israel.
Absolutely. For sure,
you know
bro.
What I'm saying?
For sure.
I mentioned dispensationalism because this is a particular theological view of the end times that says God works in these different ages called dispensations. And in the final dispensation, God will restore Israel. And the way that many people have interpreted that is God will restore the nation state, the political entity known as Israel in the modern day times. They're not interpreting this as the Jewish people or as the faith community from the Old Testament that persists into the New. They're talking about the literal political entity of Israel, the state, the nation of Israel. And so because of that, they are pro-Israel on just about every measure, because I think it's actually part of God's plan of restoration before Jesus returns. So they've wrapped up a theology, they've wrapped up an eschatology in the fate of the nation state of Israel, which for us and our views of theology in the Bible, they're not synonymous. The Israel of the Bible and the nation state, the modern nation state of Israel, and certainly not in terms of prophecy and end times kind of a stuff. And what that leads toward is you are in support of Israel no matter what, because it's part of God's plan. And that's extremely problematic because it takes away our critical lens, not only from an earthly standpoint and a political standpoint, but it also takes away our lens as loving our neighbors as ourselves. It takes away our moral and ethical lens as well.
Now, and I think, I was actually on a roundtable discussion about this shortly after October 7th, and when things started to devolve in the region. A guy named Elijah Shanak, he put together a group of people, including myself, Justin Giboney, some others, to talk about this from a kind of a theological / cultural level. And it was fascinating because one of the things that I tried to pull out is, for many people, if you actually distill down the ideas of why they support Israel so much, Israel's government so much, you get down to this idea of, it's clear that God has in the text of Scripture a love, a favor, a chosenness towards Israel.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for many evangelical Christians, we want that chosenness and that favor. We don't distinguish between Israel and America. There's like
Mm-hmm.
this, there's like this, there's like this superimposition of the closer that we can get to Israel, the more we buy into some sort of special chosenness, not as believers in Jesus, not as beloved children of God, not as, purchased people, not as chosen generation, royal priesthood. That's not what I'm talking about. As American Christians.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there is something about the American Christian idea and concept that has to be on the right. God has to be on our side. And much in the same way, there's a lot of this bleed over with support from Israel to the support of to the ideas of American Christians wanting to be favored and chosen by God, almost adopting that status. And so it's very interesting to watch kind of how people talk about it, why they talk about it, and then also this some level of control as well, right? This idea that if we elect the right president, if we put in place the right leaders who have the right public policy agenda, who have the right view on the UN, who have the right view on such and such and such and such, and we just keep pushing those dominoes, Jesus is going to come back. Jesus is going to come back. Right. And it's like, whoa. You don't have control. None of us has control.
We know not the day or the hour.
The second coming of the Savior. So I think for some people, this is kind of a little bit of an idea of control, that by being on this side and by voting and pushing it and working these angles, and by ignoring what is plain humanitarian violations, by not being able to acknowledge any sort of evil by the government of Israel, by not being able to acknowledge, when genocide is taking place, and also that these aren't pure intentions. They're not all pure intentions. That by not being able to acknowledge what is plainly in front of us, we think that we are somehow pushing forward the second coming of Christ. And that is so dangerous. And many of us have been indoctrinated in it, built in it,
big time,
discipled in it. Yes. And there's entire movements and conferences and prophetic ideas around it. And it is such a misapplication of the heart of God and the heart of the gospel for people who God loves, and which is a whole separate thing. Many of whom, and this is the wild thing, Christians.
Yeah.
This is our family. These are siblings.
Right.
And we're just turning a blind eye to the fact that they're being wiped out, displaced, and put in a space where they're receiving very little to no humanitarian aid under genocidal and oppressive circumstances. And we're just like, okay, it's about Israel. Our brothers and sisters and our siblings are looking at us like, huh? Don't we worship the same Jesus? What do you mean?
It's straight up racism and ethnocentrism, because they're brown skin, maybe Arabic speaking, right? And they're part of this entity of Palestine, of Gaza, of the West Bank. And because of that, so many people just lump them in and disregard them, right? And all of this ties into white Christian nationalism, this theocratic view that views the church and the state government as coterminous, that the fate of the church is wrapped up in the fate of the political nation state.
Yes.
Which is not at all the thrust of the Bible, and especially in the New Testament, right? But this is part and parcel of the theocratic vision that many operatives in the United States want to have in place in the U.S. And they see Israel as a critical part of that, as a critical ally of that. And even politically speaking, the United States has always supported Israel as the lone democracy in the Middle East, right? That's how it's positioned, the last bastion of democracy, stemming the tide of, Muslim rule and a theocratic rule in its own right, right? So there's already this bias for pro-Israel, this bias of, as the state goes, so goes the church, which is an unbiblical stance. And then on top of that, you have cultural movements and touch points that encourage this. So the Left Behind series of books, they had a whole strain
Bro,
around Israel and
bro.
the end times, right?
Can we talk about the Left Behind? Can we talk about Left Behind? Man, y'all, you have to understand this was the layers to this. The layers and beyond just simply what is said from the pulpit, what is spoken from our sacred desks of spiritual authority. But beyond this, we're talking about fiction books that were put in the hands of millions
Millions and
of
movies made.
and hundreds of thousands of them, probably tens of thousands of them at least. Those of us in middle school and in high
Yeah.
school, and then there were movies made, and then there was, I mean,
It's a
man,
whole thing.
Louis Gossett was in one of the films, man. Like Nicolas Cage, bro. Like, what are we talking
Yeah.
about?
Kirk
Like we're talking
Cameron.
exactly. Like we're talking about budgets. Like we're talking about movies that were got celebrated by people, and people went to the. I remember going to the movies
As a
and
youth group,
actually
probably,
as a youth group and having
Yeah.
people at certain points stand up and cheer.
Wow.
I'm telling you, this was like indoctrination for those of us,
Yeah.
and we read it and we fell in love with these characters and how it shaped our eschatology. And it's awful theology. Like, bro, they make basic errors. We're talking like it's awful theology. But again, this is the multi-layer project of pushing forward this agenda that creates now the climate for us to be okay with turning a blind eye to genocide.
Right. Right.
And saying,
right.
well, this is they've got to defend themselves. Let me tell you something. I don't what defense is there for this? Now, let me make it positively clear that I think it was November 8th. I joined a group of faith leaders, Black Christian leaders, Black pastors, and we signed this Faith Leaders for Ceasefire declaration. It was a full page ad that was taken out of the New York Times, and it was challenging the president, Joe Biden, to do three things. Okay, so these are the three things. Number one, press for bilateral ceasefire and immediate de-escalation, including in the return of all hostages held by Hamas. So that's all hostages.
Just to be clear.
Just to be clear.
Yes.
Okay, just to be clear, we're not for anybody doing any sort of sexual assault, terror, any of that. No, it was including all the hostages that were held by Hamas. Number two, secure entry of humanitarian assistance for Palestinians.
That's a big one.
Which was of huge importance. And then finally, commitment to the peace process and no war in the Middle East. Now, let me just say this. We're not saying, okay, you don't have a right to defend yourself but we also know this is a false narrative. This idea that you've never been the aggressor, this idea that this is just happening to you. These are narratives that have been set up that give us a justification to say, oh, okay, it doesn't matter how many children are killed. It doesn't matter how many children are murdered. Wow. It doesn't matter how many children. It doesn't matter how many hospitals are bombed, because there could be someone from Hamas in the hospital. I'm like, guys, what are we talking about here? This was the number one red flag for me, is whenever there was dehumanizing language coming from Israel's government. So whenever they call people dogs, whenever they call people subhuman, whenever they looked at people and said, okay, we've got to completely wipe them out, and they left them open. I'm like, y'all, this is we as Black Christians know what this we know what this leads to. Yes. We know what this means. We know what this is a call for. And so, man, it's just sad to see how this project of us trying to keep within our minds this control around eschatology and the end times has led us to ignore the plain evil that's happening in front of our faces.
And I've been there, right? So side point, but related, we have to be very discerning about who's hosting the tour, who's putting on the pilgrimage, and what angle they're coming from. There are good programs like the Telos group. They're going to give you exposure to different views and perspectives. There are
Yeah,
other
shout out to
groups.
Telos, man. Yeah,
Yeah,
seriously,
man.
bro. Shout out to them.
Really, really enlightening work that they're doing. But there are other groups that are deep down this hole
Yo,
of,
you've been in these rooms, bro. You've been in these rooms.
and they will give you this skewed perspective on they will demonize the Palestinians. They will sing nothing but praises for, again, the nation state of Israel. We're not saying that this is about Jewish people as individuals or their humanity. We're talking about the actions of the state and military conflict, right? And so you got to be very discerning about who you're getting your information from, what angle they're coming, who's supporting them, who's funding them, all of those kinds of things. And I say this as someone who has spent more time than most people from the U.S. in the Middle East. So I spent a semester there in the Holy Land, as the program was called. And we were in between Jerusalem and Bethlehem on sovereign Vatican property. I went to Notre Dame. It was Catholic property. And so we literally got both sides. So we took a history class at Bethlehem University and got a Palestinian perspective. We took a political science class at Hebrew University and got a Israeli perspective. We visited families in both areas. We went all up and down Israel. We went into Egypt and Jordan, and we got a broad exposure, right? And I'll never forget Ta-Nehisi Coates shortly after the conflict began, the latest conflict began. He said he went over there and he had heard from people, the situation's so complicated. It's so hard to understand. It's so nuanced. And he said he got over there and he said,
Nobody thinks that.
it was simple for him to see.
Yeah, he said if you go over there and spend time there, you would not think that
Right.
it was complex.
Yeah. And I'm coming from a Black American perspective, and to see the control that Israel was able to assert over the Palestinians because they had money, they had military, they had power, they had the backing of the US. So right outside of the place where we were staying was a checkpoint where Palestinians had to cross into and out of Israel. And they were subjected daily. They're just going into work, usually menial jobs, low paying jobs, right? They were going into work or coming back from work. And you had essentially teenagers because military service is compulsory in Israel. And so you had these young folks with automatic weapons, pistols, and all the power of the military and the government behind them who could just give you a hard time. Just if they were having an off day or just felt like it, right? Mm-hmm. So the power dynamic was very clear. And this is why I have this whole brand called Justice Takes Sides. In any major justice issue, conflict, ongoing movement, there is typically an empowered and a disempowered. There are typically those that have the resources of the military or weapons or government or money, and those who do not. It is rocks and bottles versus tanks and machine guns. Mm-hmm. And this is also true in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And this is not the story that we've been told, so it might rub people the wrong way.
Right.
But like I said, I've been there and I've seen the power dynamic, and it's not even close to being as complicated as now the policies and how you untangle
policies
it.
And all that's
God
above our
bless
pay
you.
grade.
That's your calling.
Yeah, that's above our pay grade, man.
But from the justice issue, no.
But I think still overwhelmingly people support two-state solution. People support all kinds of different things that, create equity for those who have been disempowered. So, but the policy side, that's above our pay grade. We recognize that. But I think it's also important to remember as we're talking about, we've been reflecting on 10 years since Mike Brown, that in Ferguson, for many people, and a lot of people have done this idea now of, these young activists, they don't really understand, they don't know all the complexities and the nuances. And one of the things that I wanted to point out to people, even on that roundtable and other spaces, is it was the Palestinians who were sending in messages of not just encouragement and solidarity for those who are fighting for freedom and liberation, marching for freedom and liberation here, but also giving advice on what to do to navigate tear gas, on
Mm.
what to do whenever the
Mm.
government does certain things. Like they were actually there,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
making sure that they provided tangible support
Wow.
when we were pushing for Black Lives Matter. I remember that. Like I remember those
Yeah.
things where they're like, "Hey, we've done this before, so when this happens, make sure that you have this available. Make sure that y'all don't go here. Make sure that you don't you like just coming alongside of those who are in an oppressive situation and saying this is how you protest and care." So for many people, they don't realize there's a connection here because in our time of need, you visited us.
Mm-hmm.
In our time of struggle, you
Hmm.
came and advocated for
My,
us.
my, 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 my.
In our time of distress, you supported us. And now they look back at us and say, well, where's the same support for us?
True enough. We're talking essentially about solidarity. And I'll never forget, it's just this principle that oppressed people know oppression when they see it. Oppressed people know
Yes.
oppression when they see it. And
Yes.
the illustration that really caught me off guard, I had the opportunity to go to Northern Ireland with the Telos group that we were talking about before. And we were looking at what they called the Troubles, which is a very euphemistic way to talk about the paramilitary violence and conflict between Protestants and Catholics for 30 years, from about the late 60s, early 70s on up to the 90s. And there's a city there called Derry, or London Derry, but depending on which side of the conflict you are on. And there's a neighborhood in Derry that is completely dedicated to murals, sides of buildings and walls and whatnot. And I remember going there. This is back in January 24, so the conflict is still pretty new to those us in the West. And there was a mural that had a Palestinian flag on it, and I forget the exact words, but it was some message, pro-Palestinian message in support of the Palestinians. And I'm like, wow, here I am in Northern Ireland in this Catholic neighborhood, and they are way ahead of a lot of people in the U.S. in supporting a people far away from them who are also oppressed, because they knew and know what oppression is like.
Yeah.
And that level of solidarity internationally, it was actually really humanizing.
Mm-hmm.
It it spoke to me to a sense of human connection across distance, across experience, but there was that shared solidarity of, we know what oppression looks like and we see you. We see you. And I just thought that was really powerful. It's always stuck with me.
That is powerful. What should we do, Jay? What should we do? We feel very hopeless and powerless in many ways. Like, what should we do in a moment like this?
I think we use the right terminology. We talked about genocide at the top of the show. I think we have to name things. That's a part of truth telling. And if we're not telling the truth about this thing, then we can't make progress on it. I think whatever administration is in power is rightly critiqued and protested for just blindly supporting a genocide, right? So we're well within our purview to resist that and to protest that stuff. I think speaking out is a big part. Like I said at the top of the show, I hesitated, and now I've written Substack posts about it, posted on social media about it. We've done a fundraiser on Justice Takes Sides about it. But it really does start, with speaking up. I think you're big on local politics.
Yeah.
And local legislators, your congressperson supposed to
That's gonna be
represent you in your
huge.
district.
Like, what
Right?
do they? There should never be a moment where they have an open forum, a round table, and there's not a question being asked of
That's
them.
right. That's
Where do
right.
you stand on this? And explain your stance. Like, explain why, and explain how you are going to represent us in this, especially if you are okay with what's happening.
So what would you say? What would you say? How do we
Yeah,
take
that man,
action?
you took mine, man. Like I really feel like pressing those who are representing us in Washington is crucial. I also think, this is a very important time for those of us who believe in having a political theology. It's a very important time for us to really, really address this. You know, I got a couple of questions on this. Every month we try to do a Q&A at our church. So I got a couple of questions on this in January, I believe, and I think again in March. But, you know, trying to be as clear as possible with our church on where we stand and why we stand there. And also, you know, shake that table. I think now is the time to shake that table. I think we oftentimes think that there's a cost associated with that, and there could be, but whatever cost we face is far less costly than those who are losing their lives, who are being displaced, who have family members whose limbs are being blown off. Like, I mean, we're talking about real life.
Bro, I read there were 20,000 children missing.
20,000 children missing.
Don't even know where they are.
You know, what does it matter?
Can you imagine?
Like,
Can you imagine?
A couple of emails isn't going to be, you know, and losing a few $1,000s in an offering plate, whatever it looks like for you, it's worth it if you get to keep your conscience and you keep your soul. And I think that's of most importance right now for those of us who believe in having a political theology, believe in discipling our people well, to how to navigate this. And then I think also drawing out opportunities in everything that we do in our gospel presentations. The gospel, I hear this a lot, man. I hear people talk a lot about the gospel from a solely individual context.
Come on.
Yes, and it really bothers me, man, because it's just that is missing the heart of God. That is missing the message of Jesus. It is not just for you and your private relationship with your Savior. The gospel has implications for your neighbor. And the gospel calls us to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, but then to love our neighbor as ourselves. And then you might ask the question, well, then who is my neighbor? Well, I'm glad you asked. Read the gospels and see who Jesus identifies as neighbor. And very rarely does he posit neighbor as someone in power who is exercising control and dominance and oppression and violence against someone who is lesser. Very often it is the one who is broken and beaten on the side of the road. And that is typically the person that Jesus is drawing out and distilling as our neighbor. And so I think it's just so crucial for us, whenever we're talking about the gospel, to push it away from simply the individual and to push us towards community, neighbor, flourishing, and the shalom and the peace, not just of our communities at home, but abroad as well.
100%. Amen. The gospel is not only individual, but corporate and communal. We must remember that.
I want to end by reading Dr. Munther Isaac's part of his Christ in the Rubble sermon for in Bethlehem on December 23rd. I thought it would be helpful for us to end hearing his words. He says, and I quote, "If you are not appalled by what is happening, if you are not shaken to your core, there is something wrong with your humanity. If we as Christians are not outraged by this genocide, by the weaponizing of the Bible to justify it, there is something wrong with our Christian witness and compromising the credibility of the gospel. If you fail to call this a genocide, it is on you. It is a sin and a darkness you willingly embrace. Some have not even called for a ceasefire. I feel sorry for you. We will be okay. Despite the immense blow we have endured, we will recover. We will rise and stand up again from the midst of destruction, as we have always done as Palestinians. Although this is by far the biggest blow we have received in a long time. But again, for those who are complicit, I feel sorry for you. Will you ever recover from this? Your charity, your words of shock after the genocide won't make a difference. Words of regret will not suffice for you. We will not accept your apology after the genocide. What has been done has been done. I want you to look at the mirror and ask, where was I?